My breath caught in my throat as I sat down at the same table, the one near the window where I had sat just 24 hours ago. The place looked the same, dim lighting, soft jazz playing in the background, and the faint smell of garlic and herbs in the air. But everything felt different now, sharper, colder somehow. I had come back, not because I wanted to relive the memory, but because I needed to escape. Escape from the hollow feeling that had been haunting me all day. I tried to tell myself it was just another dinner, another evening of pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't. Yesterday's events were still swirling in my mind, like an unfinished conversation I couldn't forget. The waiter appeared at my table with a polite smile. His hair was dark, neatly combed, and his uniform pristine. He had probably served me the night before, but I didn't remember him. I hadn't remembered much of last night, if I'm being honest. I'd been lost in the moment, swept up in something I hadn't expected. "Good evening," he said, glancing at the menu in my hands. "Would you like the same wine as last night?" His tone was casual, professional. But his words landed with an unexpected weight. I froze, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. Last night? My pulse quickened. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected him to remember, or for anyone to. I blinked, trying to gather myself. I glanced around the room, looking for anything to anchor me. But all I saw were familiar faces, couples enjoying their dinner, strangers lost in their own worlds. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. "How do you know what I had last night?" I asked, my voice sounding weaker than I intended. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering how best to answer. "You and your guest had the same wine, the 2018 Bordeaux. You seemed to enjoy it." I felt a pang of embarrassment wash over me. I had been drinking more than I should have last night, hadn't I? I had been drinking to forget, to fill the void that seemed so unshakable in my life. I didn't know if I had enjoyed the wine. But I remembered the man across from me, his smile, the way he had looked at me like I was something more than just a passing moment. But was it? Was it really something more? A flood of questions crashed over me. I had been so careless last night. The kind of careless that leads to regrets, to blurry memories, to things said and done that you can never take back. But the worst part wasn't that. It was the hollow ache in my chest. I hadn't even known his name. I hadn't asked. I hadn't cared. All I had cared about was escaping the life I had built, the life that had slowly suffocated me, piece by piece, until I was barely recognizable to myself. I looked back at the waiter, forcing a smile that felt foreign on my lips. "I'll have the same thing again," I said, my voice firmer this time. I didn't want to admit it, but I wanted to feel that same fleeting connection I'd felt last night. Even if it was just a moment. Even if it was just for a few minutes, I wanted to cling to something, anything, just to avoid the gnawing emptiness that had been creeping in. The waiter nodded politely, scribbling something down on his pad before he walked away. But I couldn't focus on him anymore. My thoughts were racing, tumbling over each other like a bad dream. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the bustling street outside. People were going about their lives, walking with purpose, lost in their own little worlds. I couldn't help but wonder if any of them felt the way I did. Did they feel empty? Did they feel like something was missing, like they were drifting through life without any real direction? Or was I the only one? I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. The wine hadn't arrived yet, but the glass in front of me seemed to mock me. It was so easy to let it all go, wasn't it? So easy to drink away the pain, to numb myself to the truth that I didn't want to face. But there was a voice in my head that refused to let me forget. It reminded me of who I used to be, of the woman I had once been before life had chipped away at her piece by piece. That woman wouldn't have come to this restaurant by herself, drowning in a glass of wine and memories of a man whose name she didn't even know. But here I was. The wine arrived, interrupting my thoughts. The waiter placed the glass in front of me, and I gave a half-hearted smile. He turned and walked away, leaving me alone again in my thoughts. I picked up the glass, swirling it absent-mindedly. The rich, deep color of the Bordeaux reflected the dim lighting around me. It was almost beautiful, the way it shimmered. But I didn't want beauty tonight. I wanted answers. And so I sat there, lost in the swirl of the red liquid, trying to piece together the fragments of a night I barely remembered. Who was he? Why had I let myself get swept away in something so fleeting? Was I just searching for an escape, or had there been something real between us? Maybe it was both. But as I stared into the glass, something inside me shifted. I realized I wasn't just searching for answers about him. I was searching for answers about myself. I wasn't sure what I would find, or if I would even like the answers. But I knew I couldn't keep pretending to be someone I wasn't. I couldn't keep running from the truth. And so, I took a sip of the wine, letting the taste linger on my tongue. Whatever happened last night, whatever that fleeting connection had been, it wasn't enough to fill the emptiness I felt inside. But it was a start. The first step, maybe, to finding something real again. I couldn't help but think about last night. Even as the wine swelled in my glass, I kept coming back to that moment when the man, who I still knew so little about, had looked at me. There was something about the way he had smiled, almost as if we shared a secret, as if everything else in the world had fallen away and there was only us, for that brief moment. But even in the clarity of that connection, I still had no idea who he was. I hadn't asked, hadn't even thought to. He had been a distraction, a blur of warmth and presence that had pulled me out of my numbness. I pushed the thoughts away, trying to focus on the here and now, but the more I tried, the more I realized how hollow the moment felt. How much of myself I was losing in this charade. A sudden wave of self-awareness hit me, and I nearly choked on my wine. My chest tightened, a familiar feeling creeping up on me, the quiet, creeping realization that I was living a life I didn't recognize anymore. A life I didn't even want. I didn't need a mysterious stranger to wake me up to the fact that I had been living in a fog for far too long. I hadn't even considered why I had come to this restaurant alone tonight. I hadn't asked myself what I was hoping for, what I was seeking. It was just another thing to fill the void. Another ritual to create the illusion that everything was okay. The same reason I wore the smile I had given the waiter. The same reason I had picked up the phone and messaged my husband, telling him I'd be out late. Out late, I said to myself under my breath, chuckling bitterly. It wasn't the truth. Not anymore. The truth was, I had been running away from something much deeper. From the life I had built, the marriage I had settled into, and the emptiness I had ignored for far too long. I sighed, feeling the weight of my own realization. I was slipping, and I didn't know how to stop. That's when it happened. The door opened with a soft chime, and I glanced up reflexively, thinking it was the waiter. But when my eyes locked onto the man walking in, I felt my stomach drop. He was here again. The man from last night. The stranger. He looked different in the daylight, or perhaps it was the setting that made him seem so ordinary. He wasn't the mystery man of the dimly lit restaurant anymore, but just a man, dressed in a simple navy blue shirt and jeans, his hair slightly mussed. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, but I could see the weariness in his eyes now. He looked like someone who had been living 1,000 lives in just a few years. I should have looked away. I should have pretended I didn't see him. But something pulled me to him, an invisible thread. I found myself frozen for a moment, watching him as he surveyed the restaurant. And then, as if feeling my gaze, he turned and his eyes locked onto mine. I quickly looked down, my heart racing. Why was I acting like this? Why was I letting something so trivial affect me so much? But then again, nothing about last night had felt trivial. Nothing about it had felt temporary. I could hear the sound of my pulse in my ears as I reached for my wine. I lifted it to my lips, but just before I took a sip, the waiter reappeared at my table, as if summoned by my anxiety. His arrival broke the spell, and I turned to him gratefully. "Would you like me to bring the menu, or do you know what you'd like?" he asked, the same professional smile on his face. I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know anything anymore. But I knew what I didn't want. I didn't want to think about last night. I didn't want to think about the man, the fleeting conversation, the connection that didn't quite make sense but still haunted me. "I'll have the same thing as last night," I said, my voice steady but hollow. The waiter nodded, writing something down before leaving me alone once again. I set the glass down on the table and wiped my hand across my face, trying to collect myself. And that's when it hit me again, the overwhelming sense of displacement. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. I wasn't sure what I wanted, what I was doing here, what I was running from. I didn't want this. I didn't want to be caught in this web of confusion, in this life that had somehow become a series of half-answers and unsaid words. I didn't want to be sitting here, in this restaurant, pretending everything was fine. I didn't want to keep drinking away the pain, numbing myself to the reality I couldn't escape. My mind flicked back to him, last night's mystery. I had been so ready to disappear into the distraction he offered. But even now, as he stood across the room, I realized I was no closer to solving the puzzle of who I was than I had been the night before. Why had I let myself get so lost? I looked across the restaurant again, almost afraid to catch his gaze. But there he was, still standing in the doorway, still looking at me. I knew I should leave. I knew I should go before I did something I would regret. But my legs felt like stone. I was frozen in place, not just physically but emotionally. I didn't know what to do. And worse, I didn't know who I wanted to be. And then, in that moment of complete vulnerability, I realized something that took me completely by surprise. I wasn't just running away from my marriage, from my husband, from the life I had created. I wasn't just looking for an escape, even though that was what I had been telling myself. I was running away from me. The woman who had convinced herself that she was content. The woman who had buried her desires, her passions, her needs, under a veil of routine and obligation. The woman who had stopped living for herself and had instead started living for everyone else. I was running from the woman who had forgotten how to love herself. And that was the scariest part of all. The glass in front of me was empty now. I had finished it without even realizing, my hand subconsciously bringing it to my lips, the swirling liquid keeping me occupied while my mind raced through endless questions. Why had I come here tonight? To relive yesterday? To feel the echo of a brief and reckless encounter? Or was it something deeper? Something darker? I pushed the empty glass aside and leaned back in my chair. The dim lights above felt a little too bright now, and the weight of the room was heavier than before. I felt trapped, like the walls were closing in on me. I needed to get out of here. But I didn't want to leave just yet. I wanted to understand. I checked my watch, the flickering seconds mocking me. It had been almost an hour since I sat down, and I had heard the sounds of the restaurant fade into background noise. A low murmur of conversation, the clink of silverware against china, the soft hiss of a distant kitchen. It was as if I was in a completely different world, one I wasn't quite sure I belonged in anymore. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor, and the noise made a few heads turn. I quickly apologized, but no one paid me much attention. I was just another face in the crowd. But I wasn't just another face. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. And that scared me more than anything else. I walked past the tables, avoiding eye contact with the other patrons as I made my way to the restroom. I needed a moment alone to collect myself, to breathe, to make sense of the mess in my mind. I didn't care if it was just a few minutes. The restroom was empty when I walked in, the fluorescent lights above flickering weakly. I leaned against the sink and looked at my reflection in the mirror. A stranger stared back at me. Her eyes were too wide, her lips pulled tight, her shoulders too stiff. There was no softness to her features, no warmth in her expression. I was trying so hard to be someone I wasn't. Trying to look composed, like I had it all together. But the truth was, I was falling apart at the seams. I wasn't sure when it had happened. When had I become so lost? I shook my head, desperate to push away the thoughts, but they clung to me like shadows. It wasn't just the wine from last night. It wasn't just the brief encounter with that man. It was everything, the way my marriage had slipped into a routine of indifference, the way I barely recognized the woman in the mirror, the way I had convinced myself that I was fine when I wasn't. And the worst part? I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know where to begin. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to clear the fog in my head. When I looked up again, my reflection had softened just a little, as if acknowledging my silent plea for clarity. But nothing felt clearer. Nothing felt right. I took a deep breath and left the restroom, my mind still tangled in confusion. I needed to leave. But as I stepped back into the main dining area, I caught sight of the waiter once again, standing by the bar. He looked up just as our eyes met, and something flickered in his expression, something I couldn't quite read. He tilted his head, as though waiting for me to make a decision. And then, without warning, he spoke. "I know it's none of my business," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "but, last night, you seemed like you were looking for something." I froze. I hadn't expected him to speak to me like that. There was a sharp edge to his words, as though he could see right through the walls I'd built. My chest tightened, and I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, I stood there, frozen, caught between the urge to deny it and the urge to confess, to explain why I had come here, why I had chosen to sit alone tonight, to unravel myself with wine and thoughts I didn't want to face. The waiter must have seen the hesitation in my eyes because he stepped closer, his posture slightly softer now, his tone less pointed. "Sometimes," he said, "people come here because they're looking for something they can't find in their everyday lives. Maybe it's something they think they can't get at home. Or something they're missing." I swallowed hard. His words hit closer to home than I cared to admit. Was that what I was doing? Was that the reason I'd let myself get swept up in a brief moment with a man I knew nothing about? I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of confusion clouding my thoughts. I don't know what I'm looking for, I said, my voice shaky. I just want to figure things out. The waiter studied me for a moment, his eyes soft but searching. He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he just nodded as though he understood, and then he turned and walked away. And in that moment, as his figure disappeared into the crowd, I felt the weight of his words settle over me. You're looking for something. What was it that I was looking for? Was it escape? Was it validation? Was it love? Or was it something deeper, something I couldn't name, something I couldn't admit even to myself? I turned and left the restaurant without finishing my meal. My feet moved automatically, my mind still grappling with the realization that I was searching for something I couldn't find in any bottle of wine or fleeting encounter. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but I knew I had to keep moving. I had to find what was missing before it was too late. The city streets blurred as I walked aimlessly, each step feeling like a progression in a story I hadn't yet written. The hum of the city surrounded me, a constant reminder that life was moving, whether I was ready for it or not. I needed to get away from the restaurant, away from the lingering questions, away from everything that felt too familiar, too suffocating. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't even know why I was walking. But it felt like the only thing I could do to get some air in my lungs. To find a piece of myself again. I reached the park at the edge of the downtown area. It was a quiet, almost serene place, a bit hidden from the chaos of the city, where the trees stretched up toward the sky as if reaching for something just beyond the horizon. I stepped off the sidewalk and onto the grass, the soft crunch of my shoes breaking the silence as I walked deeper into the park. I couldn't remember the last time I'd allowed myself to just be, to exist in a moment without running from something. My mind was filled with static, the noise of it all drowning out any sense of clarity. All I could think about were the fragments of last night, the mystery man, his smile, the way he looked at me as if we shared a secret I couldn't remember. Why had I felt that way? Why had it felt like more than just an exchange between two strangers? I sat on a bench, my hands in my lap, and tried to focus on my breathing. The air was cool against my skin, a small comfort in the midst of everything. I needed to calm down. I needed to quiet my mind. But it wasn't that easy. My thoughts kept circling back to the same thing. The same question. What do I want? I should have been able to answer that by now. I should have known what I was looking for. But the truth was, I didn't have a clue. I didn't know if I wanted to fix my marriage, or if I even could. I didn't know if I was in love with my husband anymore, or if I was just clinging to something familiar out of habit. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the bench, letting the cool breeze wash over me. For a moment, I let myself be still. And then, of course, I heard it, the buzz of my phone vibrating in my pocket. I almost didn't answer it. I didn't want to speak to anyone. I didn't want to pretend that everything was fine, that I was okay when I wasn't. But I knew who it was before I even looked. It was my husband. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my finger hovering over the answer button. The tension in my chest tightened. I didn't want to talk to him, not when I had so many questions I couldn't even begin to answer. I almost pressed ignore. But then something stopped me. I wasn't running anymore. I was standing still, and I had to face whatever it was that I was running from. So, I answered. Hello? My voice came out quieter than I intended. There was a pause on the other end, and then his voice, familiar and distant at the same time, filled my ear. Where are you? I've been trying to reach you all evening. I felt a flicker of guilt shoot through me. He sounded so casual, so unaware. I forced myself to keep my breathing steady, to not let the weight of everything show in my voice. I'm just out for a walk, I said. I needed some time to think. There was a long silence, as if he was trying to process my words. And then he asked the question I wasn't prepared for. Are you okay? You're acting different. What's going on? I could feel the walls closing in. The park, the bench, the cold breeze, it all felt suffocating now, as if I couldn't breathe, couldn't get enough space to think clearly. I don't know, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I don't know anymore. I feel like I'm losing myself. His voice softened. What are you talking about? You're not losing anything. We're fine. You're fine. I felt a bitter laugh rise in my chest. We're fine. But I didn't say anything. I couldn't find the words to explain to him what I had realized tonight. That I had been so wrapped up in a life that didn't feel like mine anymore. That I had lost myself somewhere between the daily grind and the things I thought I needed. We're not fine, I whispered, almost to myself. What do you mean? He asked. There was concern now, and for a moment, I wondered if he could hear the truth in my voice, if he could feel the distance that had been growing between us for so long. "I don't know," I said again. "I just need to figure things out." Another silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. He was still trying to figure me out, trying to understand what was happening, and I wasn't even sure I had the answers for him. "You don't need to figure everything out right now," he said gently. "Come home. Let's talk." But I wasn't ready to go home. I wasn't ready to face the reality of our life together. The life I had once thought I wanted, but now felt like a cage. A beautiful cage, but a cage all the same. "I'll be home soon," I said, not sure if I meant it. "I just need some space." He hesitated. "Okay. Just don't stay out too late." And with that, he hung up. I sat there for a while longer, staring at my phone in my hands. The silence that followed was loud and heavy, filling the empty space between the park and me. I felt it again, that deep ache in my chest, the sense that I was drifting, and I wasn't sure which direction to go in. I stood up, the cold breeze brushing past me, and I started walking again. Not toward home. Not toward the restaurant. I wasn't sure where I was going, only that I couldn't go back just yet. I needed more time. But I didn't know how much time I had left before the decisions I had been avoiding would catch up with me. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking. The city had transformed in the hours since I'd first left the park. The streets were quieter now, the sounds of cars passing by less frequent, the air cool with the scent of rain that threatened to fall at any moment. I had no destination in mind, only the need to keep moving, to avoid going back to a life that felt more like a memory than something I was still living. The phone call with my husband echoed in my mind. The sound of his voice had been so familiar, so comforting in the way it always had been, yet it felt so distant now. I could hear the concern in his voice, the way he was trying so hard to make sense of my sudden distance. He didn't get it. He didn't understand why I felt this way. But how could I explain something I couldn't even fully grasp myself? I stopped at a corner, leaning against the brick wall of a building. It was a quiet, almost hidden spot in the city. No one passed by here at this hour. It felt like a pocket of peace, even though I knew I was anything but peaceful. I pulled out my phone again, this time not to answer anyone, but to distract myself. The bright screen hurt my eyes in the dim light, but I scrolled through the messages and notifications I had ignored throughout the day. A message from my best friend popped up, one I had missed earlier. "How did the romantic weekend go? Did you guys have fun?" I stared at the message for a long time before I typed anything back. It was fine. I quickly pressed send, my fingers shaking slightly as I did. That was a lie. The weekend hadn't been fine. It hadn't been anything close to fine. It had been uncomfortable, awkward, a constant reminder that things between me and my husband weren't what they once were. I quickly put my phone away, not wanting to deal with any more lies, even the small ones. Instead, I looked out over the quiet city. The lights from the buildings reflected off the wet pavement, giving the streets a soft, almost magical glow. It was the kind of place where you could get lost in your own thoughts and not worry about being found, where you could forget the world for just a moment. But I couldn't forget. Not now. Not anymore. A thought pierced through the haze of confusion in my mind. I'm not happy. The realization hit me hard, as if it was something I had been too afraid to admit to myself for far too long. I wasn't happy with the way things had turned out. I wasn't happy with the way I had been living my life, clinging to something that no longer fit me. I had tried so hard to make it work. I had done everything I could to keep the pieces together, hoping that if I just kept moving forward, everything would eventually fall into place. But it wasn't falling into place. It was falling apart. And I wasn't sure I knew how to stop it. A chill ran through me, and I realized that the rain had started to fall, soft and steady, the droplets landing on my skin like the weight of everything I had been avoiding. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, the cold cutting through the thin fabric. But I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to go home and face the silence that awaited me there. But eventually, I knew I had to. I turned back toward the direction of the apartment, feeling the familiar ache in my chest as I walked. Every step felt heavier than the last, but I forced myself to keep moving. I had no idea what I was going to say when I walked through that door. No idea how to explain what I was feeling, how to explain the emptiness inside me that had nothing to do with my husband, but everything to do with myself. By the time I reached our building, the rain had picked up, and the streets were slick and shiny under the streetlights. I stood at the door to the building for a moment, staring at the entrance as if it were a place I didn't recognize. It felt strange, this place that used to be home. It felt like a cage now, a place I had outgrown. But I had to go in. I took a deep breath and pushed through the door, stepping into the warm lobby. The familiar hum of the elevator echoed in the quiet space. I pressed the button for our floor, waiting for the doors to slide open, my heart pounding in my chest. When the elevator reached our floor, I stepped out, my feet heavy against the carpeted hallway. I stood in front of our door for a long moment, the weight of everything making it hard to even breathe. Finally, I turned the doorknob and walked in. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet. My husband was sitting on the couch, the dim light from the TV casting shadows on his face. He looked up when I entered, his expression softening as if he had been waiting for me, though neither of us knew exactly what for. "Where did you go?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I was worried about you." I didn't know how to answer him. I didn't know what to say to make any of this feel right. "I needed some time," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I needed space to think." He nodded, but the silence between us was palpable, a wall that neither of us knew how to break. I didn't want to keep living like this, stuck between two worlds, one where I pretended everything was fine, and one where the truth was so uncomfortable, so painful, that I couldn't face it. But now, standing here, I realized something. I didn't have to keep pretending. I didn't have to keep living a life that wasn't mine anymore. "I think we need to talk," I said, my voice trembling. "About everything." And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel afraid to say it. I wasn't sure where it would lead or what would happen next. But I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't go on pretending any time longer.